This lecture is going to cover the period of American history after the Roaring 1920s, and it's going to be about the Great Depression, which is the next real era of this century that we're looking at, the 1900s to 2000. So the long 20th century here. And this is really a turn of the tides for the United States because it had been quite prosperous in the 20s. It had been a little pessimistic in some senses about international relations after the First World War, but internally during the 20s, the United States was doing quite well. It was very prosperous. People could afford luxury goods. Even lower middle class people could afford things like vacuum cleaners and refrigerators and Coca-Cola. And there was a lot of youthful energy in the country, proliferation of jazz music. It was a very bright type of era, the 1920s, but it comes to a pretty abrupt end in 1929 with the Great Depression. So we're going to explore how this happens and what the effects of this economic downturn is. So we're going to talk about the president at the time when the Great Depression first sets in the United States. The president that will be in office when this first occurs is Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover is a Republican. He rose to political prominence because he was very successful during the First World War in coordinating relief efforts for Allied nations and places like Belgium who really needed the support. So he was seen as this great humanitarian, this great organizer, this great politician. It really primed him for doing quite well politically. His biographers had said that, up until the Great Depression, as a politician, Herbert Hoover had never known failure. Everything he'd done had worked out perfectly for him. He was quite well liked. He fits in really well for the 1920s too, for the late 20s, because he considers himself a bit of a progressive, where he likes the idea of um of aid, things like he likes the idea of like aiding starving nations, and but he also doesn't really but he also felt like non-government organizations should do a lot of local charity. So he's got a pretty good attitude where, you want to help out, you want to do the right thing, he believes in science and technology, but he's kind of the a smarter progressive, like the more mature version of them because he's against foreign intervention. That's one thing that progressivism had really had a setback in, is they kind of had their taste of foreign intervention and it hadn't really worked out so well. And he's elected president in 1928. He beats the Democrat Al Smith from New York. Al Smith was seen as like very un-American. He's Catholic, which is still a little questionable for some. He's from New York, so he said he's like big city boy, whereas Hoover just came across as very wholesome and all-American. He's from Iowa. He loves animals, so all of those successes about the aid efforts he did during the First World War, so he's kind of a shoo-in for president. But there is already trouble brewing, even in the 1920s, this prosperous era. There is economic trouble brewing. And if you look at Florida politically and economically, you can see, especially the economics there, that Florida kind of foreshadows what's about to happen at large to the United States. What had happened in Florida was it becomes this microcosm of the economic troubles for the country. Trouble had been brewing for a while because investors flocked to Florida because it's warm, it's nice. People like to hang out there, go to the beach. Um, you could get there easier with automobiles, so it was encouraging more tourism, more travel during this era. And a lot of them were buying land on credit, very easily available loans. It leads to a lot of land speculation, high real estate prices. So people are just gobbling up land in Florida. A land bubble is occurring where um, you people bid on properties and the price goes up and up and up and up and it gets this crazy price, and it blows up all of the property values all around it because people are investing quite heavily thinking that this is going to be the next big thing. And they're kind of right. Florida is about to be a pretty big thing. They'll get Disney World eventually, and it always will have tourism. But what happens is it leads the a lot of these high prices being paid on properties in Florida are being paid for with loans because people don't actually have the money in hand. They got a loan from a bank to bid on a property and buy real estate down there. And eventually the real estate bubble goes up and up and up, it blows up, and eventually it just pops because you can only pay so much for something before the craze kind of dies down, the speculation boom ends, and you have a lot of land that people paid a lot of money for that they're really turns out it's worth about half of what they paid for it. Leads to a lot of kind of a snowball effect where you have people can't pay back their loans. The banks end up failing because they gave out all this money pretty willy-nilly, and now nobody can pay it back. Banks fail because they've given out all their money. They end up foreclosing on homes, and it's really very much indicative of what's about to happen wide scale in the United States because this is happening across the country. Florida kind of foreshadows what's about to occur, and that is a lot of investment, a lot of buying real estate on credit, on loans, and then people not paying that back. Banks fail, and it's just it all kind of goes downhill from there. But in this case, what happens in the beginning is a lot of it is it's stocks, investment into the real estate market, not just real estate, but just stocks and bonds, Wall Street, that type of stuff where people invest so heavily in the stock market that it forms a bubble. And when that bursts, people have these stocks that are now worth about half of what they paid. And it just leads to a bad economic system. There's so much speculation, there's so much investment with loaned money that it's just a recipe for economic disaster. And it shows the danger of very easy credit and how people can lose their homes when they buy something on a loan and then can't pay that loan back. So you don't have to know. I always say for this type of stuff, you don't have to know the ins and outs of the economics. I always think the most important part here is to kind of have a general idea about how heavy speculation and then booms and bust help bring about economic depressions. But the real important thing to keep in mind is the effects that it has. So we're going to be aiming more towards explaining the effects of a poor economy on the United States. This is a history class. We're not here to become economists. I would never ask that of you. But there's a lot of trouble. So you've got economic trouble brewing, you've got easy credit, people taking out big loans, uh, investing quite heavily in real estate and in the stocks. So you've got that happening. There's also so that's um, it's brewing. You've also got trouble on farms. Things are not quite as rosy as they seem agriculturally. Farmers had experienced a lot lower profits in the 1920s because there was a lot lower of a demand for food at this time. They'd been encouraged to farm to grow food for the war effort during the First World War, and now that the war is over and they've got so much extra food and they've got so much extra land that it forms a glut in the market. There's more food, so it makes it a lot cheaper, and farmers are having trouble getting money for their products. There's also just a lot of extra food around because during the war, farmers were encouraged to mechanize their farming practices to expand their yields as much as possible. So there's just more food being produced overall, not just because of the push for it, but because they were using better technology like this, like electric, like mechanical reapers and automobiles instead of horses. So you just have more food overall, and so food's just cheaper when there's a lot more of it. And a lot of these heavy intensive farming practices led to poor soil, the topsoil being depleted. So the Midwest, kind of middle of the United States, Kansas, that area experiences a dust bowl where this topsoil is stripped away. So whenever the wind blows, it's just sand. And it causes some pretty extreme dust storms due to bad land management practices. We'll talk more about the Dust Bowl a little bit, but there's already been some environmental issues going on in the agricultural part of the United States. So there's a couple things happening that show that trouble is on the horizon. And it all culminates on the stock market crash that happens in October 24th through 29th in 1929. The stock prices plummet because, as I mentioned, a big part of it was this bubble bursting. People had bought stocks, they'd invested so much in stocks, they'd made the price go up and up and up until eventually people start thinking, I want to sell while the price is really high. Everybody starts selling. They'd bought these on loan. Oh, it's just a total tragedy. And when people start to sell, they panic. Everybody wants to sell high. So they all start selling. Other people think, oh, I should sell too. Once everybody's selling, everything becomes worthless because when you have a stock that everybody's trying to sell, nobody wants to buy. So the demand goes down and suddenly this stock you paid hundreds of dollars for is worth maybe 20 bucks. So again, don't concern yourselves too heavily with how the stock market works. I'm pretty sure most people today still don't even know how that works. It's a mystery. But what happens is the stock market does crash because of overinvestment, people buying stock on credit. too many people owning the same stock, people trying to sell it. It's a bad combination. And what happens is a lot of companies lose money because they had invested quite heavily in the stock market. They end up laying off a lot of employees. And this is what is important to know is that when the stock market goes badly, even if you weren't bought in, even if you haven't bought into the market, you don't own stocks, you don't even know what it is. If you work for a company, chances are that they are invested somehow. And when they start losing money or they're afraid they're going to lose money, they start to cut costs by laying off employees. So it has a much broader effect on people in the United States, on average Americans, than just those who are invested in the stock market. So the ripple effect is quite heavy and extensive. A lot of companies lay off employees. And what happens is when you get laid off, a lot of people start to panic and think, I'm not going to be getting any money. I won't have money. So people rush off to the bank to withdraw their life savings. And banks at this time, there's no FDIC. There's no FDIC insurance. If you ever go into a bank, you'll see probably a little gold plaque somewhere that says this bank is FDIC insured, which means if that bank goes belly up, the federal government will step in and reimburse your savings. This doesn't exist in the 1920s. If everybody flocks to a bank and withdraws their money and there's no more money left in the bank can just close its doors and you are out of luck. That's called a bank failure. The bank has failed, there's no more money, they shutter their doors and go home. And if you have a savings account of, let's say, $20,000 in that bank and you didn't get to the bank fast enough to withdraw it, your savings is just gone. There's no protection. Because banks don't have all the money for everybody stashed away. The money is in circulation. It's being your money, you put it into a bank, you have $20,000 in a savings account in a bank. That $20,000 is not just sitting there doing nothing, waiting for you to come back and get it. Chances are the bank has loaned it out or they've invested it in the stock market. The money is in circulation. The idea being that chances are usually pretty low that everybody's going to come crashing through the doors wanting all their money at once. So they can afford to have money that's been put in their custody out being circulated. When everybody comes, this is usually called a bank rush or a bank, I think that's the term, a bank rush. They come flooding in and they rush onto the bank. If everybody tries to pull their savings out at once, it's going to lead to a bank failure. And if you are too late, you are simply too late. Your savings is gone. So a lot of people, their life savings, even if they have nothing to do with the stock market, have been totally depleted by the panic that ensues here. A lot of businesses start to fail. About 26,000 businesses fail by 1930, and the unemployment rate jumps to an incredibly high number because of all the people that have lost their jobs. About 25% of Americans are unemployed by 1932. Give you a little comparison, the average unemployment rate in the United States in 2023 was 3.5%. I think this is about the highest it's ever been was during the Great Depression. And that's why it's called a Great Depression, because the economy takes a major dump and it is a big dip there, dips way down, and the economy is considered quite depressed. And it is also, the Great Depression is as a crisis because there's much evidence that people are panicking. They are quite concerned about if the country can even survive. During this time, the suicide rate jumps to the highest ever in the United States, and the birth rate plummets to the lowest ever for several years because people are they don't have enough money to have children, and they don't want to have children in such a tempestuous, mercurial kind of economic environment where they don't know if they can even afford to take care of them. A lot of people start leaving cities too because they feel that they're better off trying to strike out on their own in rural places. There's no jobs in the city. They're going to try their hand at being self-sufficient, hoping to maybe even grow their own food. And there's even a mutterings that this might be when a communist revolution might occur. There's some fear that the political system of the United States might change because the Great Depression seemed to show that capitalism was wrong and it didn't work. Well, not just wrong, but it was not the best system. And this message about okay, it's the economic system's fault that resonates very heavily during this era because there's so much going wrong. Americans are looking for an answer. They're looking for a reason to this. You know, why did this happen so suddenly? And there is a small communist party in the United States, and they really jump on this quite heavily by trying to push for political change. And plenty of Americans are more receptive to this than they would have been prior, because when things are working out well, why change? If it's not broke, don't fix it. But when it is broke, people are going to try to think of different ways to fix it, and changing the whole political economic structure by bringing about more communist socialist policies is a lot more palatable. The idea of changing capitalism for more government-owned things that can possibly create more jobs. The Communist Party very much tries to, the small, kind of underground, almost Communist Party that had been in existence in the US, tries so very hard to make itself seem like the better option. It even offers like unemployment insurance, which most places didn't have. So when you were out of a job, you were really out of a job and you were really out of luck. There was no money coming in for you because your job didn't have unemployment insurance that really didn't exist. You were supposed to just simply get another job if you lost yours, but there are none available because a lot of companies have closed up. The pool of available jobs has shrunk to almost to a very frightening amount. So people are really questioning the American political system, and they're also really they have a lot of animosity towards Herbert Hoover because they blame him for this really, and they also a lot of Americans blame him for it in the sense that not that they think he caused it, like yeah, Herbert Hoover tampered with the economy and destroyed it. They blame him for the suffering that happens, the fact that there's no unemployment insurance or anything that the federal government is doing. They feel that Hoover is so hands off that he's not doing anything to help the American people. So he's blamed for a lot of the personal suffering that Americans endure. And a lot of homeless Americans feel that Hoover should have done more to protect them and to give them benefits or to just simply help them out. A lot of Americans, when they lose their jobs and they can't pay their rents or their mortgages, they lose their homes and they're kicked out of their apartments. And a lot of urban Americans are forced to erect shanties, really shoddily, hastily constructed huts out of just scraps like scrap metal and plywood and even cardboard boxes. And they live in these shanty towns outside of major cities, and they end up calling them Hoovervilles as a dig at Hoover because it's, why isn't he doing more about this crisis situation where people are being kicked out of their houses? Thousands of Hoovervilles emerged throughout the United States, these little shanty towns. The biggest one is in St. Louis, Missouri, where there's about 8,000 people living in one Hooverville. I think this is a picture of it, this one over here, showing all of the little shacks that people throw up pretty rapidly to have somewhere to live because they can't afford anything else. They've been kicked out of their home. They have no money to get a new place to live, so they're going to reside in there. And there was no shortage of publicity for blaming Hoover for not really picking up the slack and doing something about the situation. He wasn't doing anything to create jobs, to help with housing, to help with food, nothing. So there was all sorts of Hoover is the bad guy stuff going on, hence the name Hooverville applied to these places. You could see stuff like this where no one was shy about it. People in Hoovervilles would talk about, this is Hoover's poor farm and hard times are hoovering over us. A lot of nicknames given to stuff. A Hoover blanket was the nickname for a newspaper because that's what you were covering yourself with to try to stay warm to sleep on with some old newspaper. Hoover leather was the name given to a piece of cardboard you'd put in a hole in your shoe because you were too poor to afford new shoes, so you had some Hoover leather there. So Hoover anything, you attach Hoover's name to it, it shows how unpopular he's become because of his really really um, just his inability or unwillingness to make overtures to fix the situation. Hoover was of the opinion that this was just a regular downturn of the economy. They happen every once in a while. It'll be fine. It'll get better. But this is quite severe, and he's still not doing anything about it. So his popularity absolutely tanks. It's also quite a bad situation for a lot of minorities and women. Women are discouraged from taking jobs because the idea was if a woman had a job, that was a job that could have gone to a man who was a breadwinner and had people to provide for. So women were very heavily discouraged from taking employment during the Great Depression. Um, but that didn't mean that, some women still had to work just to make ends meet for themselves, even if they didn't have a family to provide for. And it also has this particular effect on women that are already marginalized. There were plenty of black women who would come to the North from the South looking for work, and now that there were so many, there's even more of an influx of them trying to find work in doing domestic work like cooking and cleaning. The decline in demand for it meant that you could have to hire someone to work for you for an incredibly low price, particularly in these urban areas that women flocked to trying to find jobs. And there's an area of the Bronx that becomes known as the Bronx slave market, is a term for an area of the Bronx where mostly black women who had come up from the South looking for work would line up and offer their services as domestic help, cooks and cleaners and maids for extremely low prices. They would wait in line to be offered very sadly low wages, even or work for just a few hours of the day. And the indignity of it, the having to kind of wait in line to be chosen to work and to work pretty hard for very low wages because there was so much competition for that work, gives that area the nickname the slave market because it was seen as barely a step above slavery, getting paid pitiful amounts of money to do hard work because you're desperate for any type of work, even working for food, even if someone can't pay you in with cash, maybe they'll pay you with dinner. Um, and you would be willing to take it because there is no other options. There's just so few jobs because the economy is that bad. So it's affecting everybody. It's affecting and a particularly strong effect is felt by those who are already kind of on the margins, like women and especially African American women who are in these positions where if they're unskilled, their only real uh, offer for employment is to do domestic work, like be a nanny or a maid. There's a lot of them offering those services, and too much supply drives down the price that they can charge for what they're doing for their labor. And with all this going on, as I mentioned, Hoover definitely believed that the crisis would resolve itself. He was totally against the federal government getting involved. He did not want to have them provide financial aid to the unemployed or have like soup kitchens or anything like that or housing assistance. He felt that that was not the federal government's position. He just thought, downturns are a normal part of capitalism and it will get better. He's of that school of no big government, where the best government is a small one, and and he felt that the solution to the problem was that it should be associations that took care of the needs of Americans, that it should be like non-governmental charities that did it. Private charities like the Salvation Army or a local church. They should be the ones. Associational action, the action of charitable associations should be the ones to take care of the needs of Americans. The Salvation Army should have soup kitchens and give out food to the unemployed. Local churches should try to raise money to maybe pay for rent for a very impoverished family so that they could stay in their home. It should be up to the local charities and churches and stuff and philanthropic, maybe individuals, to take care of the social problems that the Depression caused. But the problem is that they're so taxed that they can't keep up. The Salvation Army relies on donations. People are broke. They're not donating to the Salvation Army at the exact same time that everybody needs the Salvation Army's food and clothing. So they're stretched to their limits, and these associations cannot keep up with the extreme demand on their services. In a slight downturn, yes, it might have been possible that charitable actions would be able to buoy the country through bad times, but the times are so bad that even the charities can't keep up. And then things simply keep getting worse because of a series of actions that Hoover and his administration take. One of them is the passage of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which is a tariff act which passed in 1930. It was designed to raise a tariff, which is just a tax, on stuff imported to the United States with the idea that if you made foreign goods super expensive, people would have to buy stuff in the United States, and that would raise demand for United States made goods, domestically made products, and that would help boost the economy because people would simply turn inwards and start making stuff again, and people would because there'd be more of a demand. So that was the thought, is we can increase domestic production and domestic demand if the government kind of cuts off the availability of foreign made stuff, and this should help the economy and make jobs. However, a lot of other nations are struggling too. The Depression is a worldwide event. A lot of other countries feel the effects of the stock market crash. Germany, in particular, will suffer quite heavily for this, which will give the Nazi Party an even better foothold on the country. but a lot of other countries are suffering, and they all implement retaliatory tariffs, which causes a decrease in trade and export from the US because what other countries do is places like Britain, they hear, oh, the United States has put a tariff on our goods because they don't want to buy them. Well, we're going to put a tariff on the United States' goods and we won't buy them. So there's less demand abroad now, too. Instead of creating domestic demand, they've cut everything. The tariff that makes foreign goods more expensive angers foreign countries, and they end up not buying United States goods, so there's just less demand overall and there's less jobs. It ends up really hurting the country even worse. You can see this little ad here about economists asking Hoover to not pass that tariff bill because they exactly what this is what they feared would happen, and it does come to fruition that it just trying to do this hurts the country even worse. Um, the lack of all of these, the lack of progress and improvement meant that Hoover, by 1932, Hoover could finally admit that, okay, they're not improving quick enough. Um, the tariff was a bad idea. The associational action can't keep up. The associations can't keep up with the demand. So he signs into law the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. What it does is it uses federal money to infuse money into businesses and banks that are failing. It's money to provide some relief for homeowners that are facing foreclosure, and it tries to create some government-funded jobs just to make jobs so that people can work and feel like they are being productive. Because a lot of Americans, there was really no unemployment aid, there was no um, just like handouts or anything. There was no just money directly given to Americans in times of crisis, no economic stimulus or anything. Part of it was because the government didn't have the structure to do that. It's still an era of keep the government quite small. But it was also because a lot of Americans were resistant to that. Like this sign here, I want a job, I don't want charity. A lot of Americans, especially American men, wanted the government to simply do something to bring back jobs because they wanted to work and provide for their families that way, like they always had. They didn't want a handout, they didn't want charity. It was quite offensive to a lot of people's sensibilities and sense of self-worth that they wanted to be self-sufficient, take care of themselves. So Hoover kind of rides that sentiment and doesn't do any direct employment, no direct unemployment aid. So if you're jobless, you're not getting unemployment benefits until you get a job. You just have to hope your savings carries you through, or hope that charities can kind of carry you through until you get your next job, if you do end up getting one. So Hoover does a little bit, but all of this stuff here that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation does is a a drop in the bucket. It doesn't really help at all. It's so half-hearted. Hoover really feels like all of this is against his core principles of government intervention into the economy that it's such a little bit that it really doesn't do anything to stem the tide of unemployment and housing loss and lack of jobs. And because of this, yes, a lot of Americans are they don't want charity, they don't want handouts, but they still feel like something should be done to create the job so that they can be self-sufficient. Just the lack of options really is quite frustrating for especially American men who had been used to um, being able to provide for their families and enjoy luxury goods like those Coca-Colas and those radios. The lack of these options leads to a social phenomenon that emerges among men as the sentiment that they felt that they were forgotten. The forgotten man is a concept that applies to American working men who felt that their interests were being ignored, that they were overlooked, unaided, kind of forgotten, as the term implies, and just pushed aside by society. That there was a segment of men whose jobs were not being restored, they couldn't provide for their families, and nobody was really doing too much about this to restore their pride and self-worth. They didn't want to wait in a soup kitchen line. They didn't want to receive handouts. But there's nothing else that they can do, and it seems like the world has forgotten them. This is a painting called Forgotten Man by artist Maynard Dixon from 1934, and it really encapsulates this sentiment quite well. This is a man that probably worked for a living his whole life and took pride in that, and now he's unemployed and possibly homeless, and everybody is just walking right by him. Nobody's even looking at him. He has been forgotten by everybody, including the government and just everything else. No one is doing anything to assist him. He has been forgotten, and that is uh, very disarming and very disheartening. There is a movie from the 1930s. It's called Gold Diggers of 1933. There's a whole series of wacky movies with the name like Gold Diggers of 19 whatever. But it's one of those movies where it's essentially just a long string of musical numbers, and that's one of the things to watch for this week. Is this clip of the Forgotten Man, because it really encapsulates who the Forgotten Man is someone who might have even been a World War One soldier and now can't even afford bread for his family. So it's a real turn of the tide, a real dip in fortune for men who had once really felt that they were on top of the world and now everything is against them, that their social status has taken a real 180 and they're not enjoying the same privileges that they once were, and everybody else is suffering for it. The forgotten man has a family as well that he's trying to provide for, and forgetting about these men lack and not helping them is also forgetting about all of the dependents that rely upon a man who works, a man who is a breadwinner. And things have changed so much that this is a very noticeable social phenomenon, so much so that they make a little musical number about it in this musical movie. And a big part about this is the fact that a lot of the men who are now unemployed and their country can't take care of them had been World War One veterans. They had served their country and now they feel that their country is not there for them, even though they had risked a lot, life and limb, for their nation. A lot of them are now poor, homeless, unemployed, and very disillusioned with what the country can offer them. And in 1932, a group of veterans known as the Bonus Army, they're 17,000 strong. They set up a camp in Washington, D.C. to demand payments that had been promised to them earlier. What happened was in 1924, veterans who had served in the First World War, they were given a promise. They were given these certificates that say they can be redeemed for money plus interest in 1945. Instead of paying them outright, they were given these little promissory notes, like little investment tickets or something that said, "You'll get this money in a couple years, let it grow." And what happens is the bonus army marches on Washington, D.C. and basically demands that they get the money now because they need it now. Their families are hungry, they're homeless, they serve their country, they can't wait till 1945 to get the bonus that they feel that they are owed for their service. They camp out in front of the White House in order to try to gain attention for their cause. Again, it's very noticeable. They call themselves the Bonus Army because they're Army veterans who want their bonus, and they are hoping to get Hoover's attention. However, Hoover is determined that he will not be strong-armed and intimidated into giving this bonus, so he takes a very heavy-handed approach to the Bonus Army. He sends out the federal police to push out the protesters and their families because a lot of men had brought their whole family with them to camp out in these tents outside of the White House. And in the ensuing scuffles, two veterans are shot and killed. And the Hoovervilles, these little Hooverville tents that are set up outside of the White House, are removed with tanks and then burned down. So it's a very poor display on Hoover's part. It makes him even more unpopular because a lot of Americans see this as just indicative of his overall treatment of Americans, and very much painting a picture of how he's dealing with the situation is just shoving it away and being quite violent about it. His popularity, which is already in the sewer, somehow gets even lower after this because he's seen as this is, him still not acknowledging the problem, even when it's brought right to his doorstep. Killing veterans, burning down tent encampments that homeless veterans were staying in, wins Hoover absolutely no favors. And in the election of 1932, because it's a presidential election year, as you might have guessed, Hoover ends up doing quite poorly.